welcome, dear listener, to a place where mysteries come alive. Here, we bring you timeless tales of clever detectives, hidden motives, and unexpected twists. Whether it's the daring charm of Tommy and Tuppence, or the keen intellect of Poirot, every story invites you to think, to feel, and to solve the case. Stay curious, and welcome to Guardian of the Night Stories.
The Jordan sun hung low over Petra's rose-tinted cliffs as Hercule Poirot adjusted the brim of his Panama hat with characteristic precision. Before him, the ancient Nabatean city rose in impossible splendor, columns of crimson and violet stone. Carved into the desert floor millennia ago, weathered by wind and silence into something approaching the sacred. "Remarkable," murmured Captain James Hastings, Poirot's longtime companion and chronicler, though his tone suggested he was remarking upon the discomfort of the heat quite as much as the archaeology. "Extraordinary place," Poirot rather makes one feel the weight of history, doesn't it? Poirot did not immediately respond. He stood motionless, his patent leather shoes somehow immaculate despite the ruddy dust that coated everything else. His egg-shaped head tilted slightly as he surveyed the treasury, that magnificent facade carved into the cliff face. His small, precise moustache caught the dying light with mathematical exactitude. "History, mon ami," he said at length, "is merely the accumulated record of human nature. We come, we see, we are awed, yes. But the hearts of men and women, they remain the same, ambitious, jealous, desirous. The setting changes. The psychology, it does not." Hastings had learned not to argue with these pronouncements, even when they seemed unnecessarily dark. Instead, he helped Poirot descend the final stone steps toward the encampment where their party was housed. The excavation season at Petra had attracted an unusual collection of guests to the colonial-style hotel erected near the site. There was Lord Edgware himself, the Marquis of Edgware, to be Pressy, a man of 63, with silver hair, a clipped accent, and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. His reputation preceded him, a noted archaeologist, a trustee of the British Museum, and, by all accounts, a man of considerable fortune, amassed through judicious property holdings across the empire. Also present was his recently acquired second wife, the former Miss Vivian Ashford, 32 years old, striking rather than beautiful, with dark hair arranged in the latest fashion and an air of practiced charm that reminded Hastings of a photograph he had once seen of the actress. Lily Langtry. She wore jade and emeralds with casual elegance, and she moved through rooms with the peculiar grace of someone accustomed to being observed. Then there were the others. Lord Edgware's son from his first marriage. Richard was a man of 35, a barrister by profession and a disappointment to his father by nature. Richard bore the distinguished features of his house, but carried them with an anxious diffidence, and he had arrived at Petra only 2 weeks prior, ostensibly to assist in the cataloguing of newly discovered artifacts. But, as Hastings soon gathered, primarily because his father had demanded his presence in a curt telegram. Lady Constance Edgware, the Dowager, Marsh and Ice occupied a suite at the hotel, with the attitude of a woman enduring an extended inconvenience. She was Lord Edgware's sister, aged 58, with a sort of stern, handsome face that suggested generations of people had been disappointed by her opinions. She had come to Petra, she made clear, only because her brother had insisted upon her presence during his new marriage. presumably to lend the union some dignity. The fifth member of the household party was Mr. Augustus Frampton, Lord Edgware's secretary and man of business, a thin, nervous gentleman of 47, with wire-rimmed spectacles and fingers that perpetually fidgeted with papers and pen. He had been in the family's employ for more than 15 years, and possessed the slightly apologetic demeanour of someone who has spent his career answering to others. Finally, there was Miss Sarah Munford, a young woman of 24, who had been engaged as an assistant to catalogue the archaeological finds. She was neither particularly beautiful nor particularly plain, but she possessed an intelligent face, capable hands, and a quiet manner that suggested a preference for observation over participation. She was the daughter of a deceased Oxford professor and had no family to speak of, a circumstance that perhaps explained her willingness to travel to the remotest corners of the globe in pursuit of her scholarly interests. It was on the second evening of Poirot and Hastings's arrival at Petra that the first peculiarity became apparent. Poirot and Hastings had been invited to dinner in the private dining room of the hotel, a gesture of hospitality extended by Lord Edgware himself, who had learnt of their presence through the hotel manager and, being a man of cultural sensibilities, had thought it amusing to entertain a famous detective. The dinner was, by all conventional measures, a pleasant affair. The cook had managed an impressive meal despite the limited provisions available in such a remote location, and the conversation had ranged pleasantly across topics of archaeology, international affairs, and the peculiar habits of tourists. It was Hastings who noticed, as the port was being served, that Lord Edgware had gone rather pale. "I say," Hastings ventured quietly to Poirot, "do you observe Edgware? Appears positively unwell." Poirot, who had been engaged in polite discourse with Lady Constance regarding the architectural principles of ancient structures, turned his attention with subtle smoothness toward their host. He noted, with the precision that had made him famous, several small facts: a tightening around the eyes, a slight tremor in the hand that reached for his glass, a microsecond's hesitation before responding to a remark from his wife. But it was what happened next that truly captured Poirot's interest. Lord Edgware's secretary, Mr. Frampton, who had been consulting a small leather notebook regarding some matter of the next day's catalogue work, suddenly closed the book with such force that it produced an audible snap. He began to speak, his voice uncharacteristically firm. "My lord, I must insist that we discuss the matter of the Armenian documents. They require your attention immediately, and I cannot take further responsibility for—" "Not now, Frampton," Lord Edgware interrupted, his voice sharp as flint. The colour in his face, which had drained moments before, now rushed back in angry crimson. "Surely you understand the distinction between appropriate and inappropriate moments for business matters." The rebuke fell upon the table like a stone dropped into still water. Frampton's face flushed with humiliation, and he mumbled an apology, turning his attention pointedly to his plate. But Poirot, observing the exchange with the intensity of a chess master studying an opponent's first move, noted something curious. The secretary's embarrassment seemed to mask something else entirely, something more like fear. Lady Constance cleared her throat with deliberate loudness and launched into an anecdote regarding a recent exhibition at the British Museum, her tone suggesting that the Frampton interruption had been merely an unfortunate breach of protocol, nothing more. Richard Edgware stared into his wine-glass as though seeking prophecy within its depths. Miss Sarah Munford folded her napkin with meticulous care. and Vivian Edgware smiled. It was not a warm smile, nor even particularly mischievous. It was, rather, the smile of someone who had just seen a private joke confirmed. She reached across the table and touched her husband's arm with a gesture that might have been reassuring, had it not possessed a distinctly proprietary quality, as though she were marking her territory. "Poor Frampton," she said, her voice liquid with false sympathy. "One can see he is quite overwrought by the work. Perhaps you might allow him a day's rest, Edward. Surely the Armenian documents can wait another 48 hours. It was here that Poirot intervened with a question that, to all appearances, was nothing more than the polite curiosity of a guest. But Hastings, who had known his companion for many years, recognized the particular angle of Poirot's head and the intensity of his dark eyes. "These Armenian documents, they are of great significance?" Poirot inquired, directing his question to Lord Edgware with an air of genuine interest. "I confess I know very little of such matters. They are historical, yes." Lord Edgware, his composure largely restored, smiled with the condescension of the expert addressing the layman. "Medieval manuscripts, Monsieur Poirot, of considerably value to certain collectors, though I suspect the academic interest exceeds the monetary. Frampton tends to become rather agitated when matters of cataloguing fall behind schedule. It is, I'm afraid, one of his less endearing qualities." Frampton made a noise that was neither agreement nor dissent, and the conversation shifted to safer waters. But the damage, as it were, had been done. Poirot had observed the crack in the facade, and he filed it away in that magnificent repository of observation, his little grey cells, with the precision of a librarian organizing volumes by system and cross-reference. After dinner, as Hastings and Poirot took their ease in the hotel's modest lounge, the former broached the subject that had clearly engaged his companion's mind. "That was an odd bit of business at dinner," Hastings said, accepting the cigarette that Poirot offered him. Rather seemed as though Edgware had something on his mind before Frampton spoke. "What did you make of it?" Poirot settled himself into a chair with deliberate comfort, arranging his posture to perfection before responding. "What did I make of it, mon ami? I made, as I always do, observations. Small ones, but they accumulate, yes. I observed that Lord Edgware was in some distress before the secretary's interjection. I observed that Mrs. Vivian Edgware smiled with satisfaction at the social discord. I observed that Mr. Frampton's embarrassment was not entirely convincing. Beneath it lay something more urgent. And I observed that young Richard Edgware avoided looking at anyone during the entire exchange. Meaning, Hastings prompted. Meaning, my dear Hastings, that we have stumbled upon a household in which matters are not as peaceful as they appear. This is interesting, then. You and I, we have encountered murder in pleasant drawing rooms before. We know that the setting of tranquility often precedes the eruption of violence most dramatically. Surely you don't suggest that something criminal is afoot?" Poirot smiled, that small, enigmatic smile that suggested he knew far more than he was currently inclined to reveal. "I suggest nothing, Hastings. I merely observe. But I think perhaps we shall remain at Petra a little longer than we had initially planned. Yes, the archaeology, it is fascinating, but the human nature here that is far more worthy of study." Over the following days, Poirot and Hastings became increasingly incorporated into the social life of the Edgware party, a circumstance that seemed to please Lord Edgware immensely, as it lent an air of distinction to his excavation. Poirot accepted invitations to tour the site, to examine newly discovered artifacts, and to dine with the household all, while maintaining the air of a polite guest with nothing more pressing on his mind than scholarly curiosity and the appreciation of ancient history. It was during these interactions that the true portrait of the Edgware household began to emerge. Lord Edgware, upon closer observation, was a man of contradictions. He possessed a genuine passion for archaeology and an almost scholarly approach to the cataloguing of finds. Yet he was also impetuous, vain, and increasingly prone to imperious demands that suggested a man accustomed to instant obedience. His relationship with his wife was cordial in public, but suffused with an undertone of tension that Hastings found profoundly uncomfortable to witness. There was a quality of performance to their interactions, as though each were playing a carefully rehearsed role in a theatrical production. Viviane Edgware revealed herself to be a woman of considerable intelligence, masked beneath a veneer of decorative charm. She spent much of her day reading. Hastings observed her with novels by Wilde and Shaund. She seemed to find the routines of desert life amusing rather than arduous. She was unfailingly polite to the household staff, kind to Miss Sarah Montford, and perfectly correct in her dealings with Lady Constance. Yet there was something underneath all this correctness, something that put one in mind of a cat watching a mouse hole with patient inevitability. Richard Edgware, the son, became increasingly visible in the social arrangements, and Hastings found himself warming to the young man despite, or perhaps because of his obvious unhappiness. Richard possessed none of his father's authority or confidence. Instead, he seemed to carry the weight of disappointed expectations like a prisoner's chains. On one occasion, Hastings found him alone in the hotel's small library, staring out the window toward the cliffs of Petra with an expression of such profound melancholy that Hastings was moved to inquire whether he was quite well, perfectly well. "Thank you," Richard replied, with the automatic courtesy of someone whose politeness is a learned habit rather than a genuine sentiment. "Only contemplating the curious business of family obligation. My father wished me here. Therefore, I am here. It is, as they say, the natural order of things. It seems to cause you considerable distress." Hastings ventured gently. Richard turned to face him, and Hastings was struck by the intelligence in the young man's eyes, imbibed with a kind of desperate resignation. "Does it? I was endeavoring not to display my feelings so openly. My father has little patience for emotional display, and my stepmother—" He paused, searching for words. "My stepmother finds my unhappiness amusing, so I endeavor to maintain equanimity. It is a useful skill in one's family." Lady Constance, meanwhile, proved to be a woman of sharper wit than one might have initially supposed. She had little patience for pretense, and even less for what she termed newfangled sentiment. She spoke to her brother with a familiarity born of long sibling association, which meant that she alone seemed capable of addressing him without deference or fear. Yet even she seemed troubled by something, and more than once Hastings observed her in consultation with Mr. Frampton, her usual stern features arranged in an expression of concern. It was Mr. Frampton himself who seemed most visibly unsettled. The secretary appeared increasingly haggard, with dark shadows beneath his eyes that suggested sleepless nights. His usually meticulous dress became slightly dishevelled, and his hands, which had always been nervous, now trembled with what seemed to be genuine distress. More than once, Hastings observed him in heated but whispered conversation with Lord Edgware. their tones suggesting disagreement that went well beyond the usual discord between employer and employee. And Miss Sarah Munford. She maintained her quiet, observant demeanour throughout, but Hastings noted that her eyes followed certain individuals with particular intensity. She seemed especially attentive to the interactions between Vivienne and Richard Edgware. Shin Wei-watchin. Their exchanges with the absorption of someone who was piecing together a complex puzzle. When Hastings, emboldened by several glasses of wine one evening, asked her whether she was enjoying her work at Petra, she responded with unusual candour. "I confess, Captain Hastings, that the archaeological work is fascinating, but the human drama surrounding it is rather more compelling. The Edgware household is not, I think, as harmonious as they wish the world to believe." "You have perceptive eyes, Miss Munford," Hastings replied, "though I should caution you against assuming that family discord necessarily leads to tragedy. Most households contain a degree of tension without descending into catastrophe." "Indeed," she said softly. "Yet I wonder sometimes whether catastrophe merely requires the correct confluence of circumstances to transform ordinary tension into something far more dangerous." It was on the 5th evening of their stay that Poirot elected to share with Hastings the fuller scope of his observations. They were walking along the path that led from the hotel toward the treasury, the evening air cool and sweet with the scent of desert flowers that bloomed despite the aridity. The cliffs of Petra glowed with the last light of the setting sun, and the ancient city seemed almost sentient in its beauty as though it watched the small human dramas, unfolding at its base with the ironic amusement of something that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. "I have obtained certain information," Mon ami Poirot began, his tone suggesting that the information in question had been obtained through means that were methodical but not entirely transparent. "It appears that Lord Edgware's marriage to Vivienne is less than a month old. They were wed in London in circumstances that his family clearly found ... inconvenient." "How did you discover this?" Hastings asked, surprised. "He certainly gives no indication of recent marriage." "The ease between them, the ease is precisely what is interesting," Poirot interrupted. "There is no honeymoon bliss, Hastings. There is calculation. I have made inquiries with the hotel staff. They are always most informative to a man who remembers to tip generously and speak to them as human beings rather than servants. They tell me that Lord Edgware and his wife rarely retire to their suite simultaneously, that arguments are sometimes audible through the connecting doors, and that Mr. Richard Edgware has been observed pacing the corridors at night in a state of evident distress." "Good Lord," Hastings murmured. "You don't imagine—" "I imagine nothing. I observe. I deduce from observation. Now, what do I know? I know that Lord Edgware married very recently to a woman considerably younger than himself, a woman who was, prior to the marriage, employed as a society hostess and companion to certain wealthy widows. I know that this marriage has disturbed his son deeply. I know that his secretary is in a state of nervous collapse, seemingly related to certain documents of Armenian provenance that he wishes desperately to discuss with Lord Edgware. I know that Lady Constance, who would naturally be consulted in all family matters, seems to have been excluded from the decisions surrounding this marriage. And I know," he concluded with particular emphasis, "that Mrs. Vivienne Edgware is not who she appears to be." "What makes you say the last?" Hastings demanded. "Surely that is mere speculation." "Not speculation. Deduction," I observed her hands. "You see, they are the hands of a woman who does not work. This is natural enough. But I also observed that she adjusts her jewelry with the careless habit of someone accustomed to genuine valuables. Yet she glances, ever so slightly, to gauge the reaction of others to these valuables. A woman born to wealth does not perform jewelry as a woman of acquired wealth does. She wears it without thought. Mrs. Vivian performs her jewelry as an actress performs lines. They walked in contemplative silence for a time, the implications of these observations settling over them like the gathering dusk. You think she has married him for his money? Hastings ventured at last. Money, yes, but also, I think, for something more. For position, for security, for the ability to transform herself into something that the world will respect. These are not contemptible motives, mon ami, merely human ones. And in a household where such transformations are occurring, where secrets are concealed and tensions simmer beneath the surface of civility, the possibilities for tragedy are considerable. The crisis, when it came, emerged not from any dramatic confrontation, but rather from a piece of paper. It was on the morning of their 7th day at Petra that Lord Edgware's voice, sharp with fury, could be heard emanating from his private study. The shouting was not continuous, but rather punctuated periods of silence, presumably during which his interlocutor was responding, followed by fresh eruptions of anger. Hastings, who was in the corridor retrieving a book he had left in the library, the previous evening, was startled by this display of raw emotion. He had not previously heard Lord Edgware truly angry. Irritated, yes. Imperious, certainly. But this was genuine, barely controlled rage. He made a discreet retreat and found Poirot in the hotel's modest morning room, perusing a copy of the Times that had arrived with the Daily Post, several weeks late, but news nonetheless. Did you hear? Hastings asked, his voice low. Poirot looked up from his newspaper with an expression of unsurprised interest. Ah, yes. The disturbance. It seems that whatever tensions have been building beneath the surface have finally erupted into open conflict. This is, I think, inevitable. The human capacity for restraint is limited, particularly when pride and fear are combined. They did not have long to wonder about the cause of the explosion. Within the hour, Mr. Frampton appeared in the morning room, his face devastated and his thin frame trembling with evident shock. He sought out Poirot with an urgency that suggested he had been wrestling with a burden and had finally reached the point of seeking external counsel. Monsieur Poirot, he began, his voice hoarse, I must speak with you in confidence. I confess that I am not entirely certain what to do, and I find myself in a position of considerable moral difficulty. Poirot set aside his newspaper with deliberate care and gestured toward the chair opposite him. Please, he said simply, sit. You are distressed. Tell me what has occurred. Frampton sank into the chair, as though his legs could no longer support him. This morning, he began, his words tumbling out in a desperate rush, Lord Edgware discovered a letter. It was addressed to his wife, Mrs. Vivian. The letter was old, dated from 3 years ago, and it concerned a matter that I believed was entirely concluded and forgotten. What manner of matter? Poirot prompted gently. Frampton wrung his hands in an agony of uncertainty. I fear that in speaking of this, I may be betraying confidences that were shared with me in my capacity as his secretary. Yet I also fear what may occur if this matter remains concealed. It is a most dreadful position. Tell me, Poirot said. and there was something in his tone, some quality of absolute certainty that one would be understood and judged without condemnation that seemed to break through Frampton's resistance. 3 years ago, the secretary began slowly. Lord Edgware was involved in a matter of considerable delicacy. There was a woman he was involved with, you understand, in a manner that was inappropriate to his position and his marriage at that time. She was the wife of a business associate. The affair lasted for approximately 8 months, and it ended when the woman's husband discovered the relationship and demanded that it cease. Lord Edgware, being Lord Edgware, simply did so. He is not a man who allows sentiment to override practical considerations. In this letter, Poirot inquired. This letter was written by the woman in question. Her name was Margaret Ashford, though she was married at the time and went by her husband's name just after the affair ended. It was a farewell letter, professing her continued affection for Lord Edgware, but acknowledging that they could never be together. It was, I believe, intended merely as closure. Lord Edgware received it, and I helped him dispose of it, burned it, as I recall. Yet it appears a copy existed. Apparently so. And somehow, and here is the truly remarkable part, this letter has come into the possession of Mrs. Vivian. This very morning, Lord Edgware received it with a note suggesting that unless he revised his will to leave Vivian a considerable sum independent of his son's inheritance, the letter would be delivered to certain newspapers known for their interest in scandal involving the aristocracy. Hastings, who had entered the room during the course of this confession, uttered an exclamation of shock. Blackmail? Good God! The woman is engaged in outright blackmail. Indeed, Frampton said miserably, and that is not the only matter. I have ascertained, through my investigation of the files, that just after Lord Edgware met Mrs. Vivian, which was approximately 3 months ago, introduced to her by a mutual acquaintance, he received several communications from persons claiming to be creditors of a deceased relative. These communications were fraudulent. I recognized the handwriting as that of a man known to operate confidence schemes across Europe. I meant to tell Lord Edgware of this, but he seemed so ... so animated by this young woman that I could not bring myself to distress him with what I suspected might be merely preliminary investigations. You believe Mrs. Vivian is connected to these schemes? Poirot asked. I believe, Monsieur Poirot, that Mrs. Vivian Edgware may not be Mrs. Vivian Edgware at all, if you take my meaning. The woman's background is entirely obscure. No one seems to know anything definitive about her. She simply appeared in London society approximately a year ago, and within months she had caught Lord Edgware's attention. He became quite besotted, ignoring the counsel of his family and his friends. And now we have this blackmail scheme emerging. Poirot was silent for a long moment, his fingers pressed together in that characteristic gesture of concentration that Hastings had come to know well. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of certainty. Where is Lord Edgware now? In his study. He has locked the door and refused to admit anyone. He is, I believe, deeply shocked and also deeply angry. I fear. Frampton paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. I fear what he may do when confronted with this betrayal by a woman he trusted so completely. Poirot rose with a fluid grace that belied his 60+ years. We must speak with him. It is now a matter of considerable importance. Mr. Hastings, will you accompany me? And Mr. Frampton, I must ask that you remain here. There are certain matters I wish you to clarify once I have spoken with Lord Edgware. They found Lord Edgware's study locked, as Frampton had indicated. Poirot knocked with firm precision, and after a long moment, the door was opened by Lord Edgware himself. The man's face was suffused with anger, yet there was something beneath the anger, a kind of cold calculation that suggested his rage was being channeled into thought rather than action. "Poirot," he said, recognizing his visitor with apparent surprise, "I am not at my best today, I'm afraid." "This is not the ideal moment. On the contrary," Poirot interrupted gently, "this is precisely the ideal moment. I know what has transpired. This morning, Mr. Frampton, in his concern for your welfare, has felt compelled to confide in me, and now I believe we must speak of it frankly." Lord Edgware's face darkened further, and he began to speak, but Poirot raised his hand in a commanding gesture. "Allow me to speak first, please. Then you may question me as you wish. I have for several days observed your household and noted certain peculiarities. I have, through perfectly legitimate means, made inquiries regarding your wife's background. What I've discovered suggests that Mrs. Vivian Edgware may well be engaged in a scheme of deception and extortion. Is this not the case?" For a long moment, Lord Edgware said nothing. Then, with a gesture that suggested utter exhaustion, he gestured for them to enter the study and closed the door behind them. The room was lined with books and comfortable furniture, with a desk that held scattered papers and, most notably, a letter written in a feminine hand. "This letter," Lord Edgware said, lifting it with 2 fingers as though it were contaminated, "was delivered to my wife this morning by courier. She, in a fit of what I can only describe as theatrical revelation, brought it to me approximately an hour ago. The letter pertains to a matter of my past, a matter which I had believed was entirely concluded and which I certainly had not intended to become the subject of blackmail." He read portions of the letter, allowed passages that detailed his affair with Margaret Ashford, and hinted darkly at confidential information regarding business dealings that could prove embarrassing to Lord Edgware's reputation. The letter concluded with a series of demands that effectively constituted extortion. "What does your wife say regarding this letter?" Poirot asked, his tone carefully neutral. "That is the astonishing part," Lord Edgware replied bitterly. "She claims no knowledge of the scheme. She insists that the letter was delivered to her in sealed envelope with no indication of its source. She further suggests that it may be a trick perpetrated by someone wishing to discredit her in my eyes. She is either an accomplished liar or the victim of a plot that she herself did not anticipate." "A third possibility exists," Poirot suggested softly. "Perhaps she is complicit in the scheme, but has calculated that open denial, when confronted, would prove more effective than confession." "Precisely," Lord Edgware agreed grimly. "Which brings me to the matter of considerable moment. I am now faced with a choice, Monsieur Poirot. I can submit to this blackmail, which would effectively hand over control of a substantial portion of my wealth to a woman who has deceived me. Alternatively, I can refuse to submit, report the matter to the authorities, and thereby invite the very scandal that the blackmailers are threatening to create. Both options are deeply unpleasant. There is a third option," Poirot suggested. "One may discover the truth. One may ascertain whether your wife is genuinely complicit in this scheme, or whether she is herself the intended victim. One may identify those responsible for the extortion and ensure that they face justice. This third option requires patience and intelligence, but it is, I think, the only truly satisfactory solution. Lord Edgware studied Poirot for a long moment. You believe you can accomplish this? I believe that truth, like beauty, has a particular order to it. It reveals itself to those who know how to observe carefully. Yes, Lord Edgware, I believe. I can accomplish this, but I will require your complete cooperation and, I must add, your discretion. You must tell no one of this conversation save for those individuals I deem it necessary to inform. Lord Edgware, after a moment's hesitation, extended his hand. You have my word, Monsieur Poirot. I place this matter entirely in your hands. Over the following days, Poirot conducted his investigation with the methodical precision that had made his reputation legendary. He moved through the small world of the Petra excavation site and hotel with apparent casualness, yet each conversation, each observation, was directed toward the accumulation of evidence and the construction of a hypothesis. He interviewed Vivian Edgware at length, observing not merely what she said but how she said it, noting the microsecond hesitations that preceded certain responses, the particular angles at which she averted her eyes when discussing certain topics. He found her alternately defiant and submissive, as though she were trying on various emotional performances in search of the one that would prove most effective. I know nothing of this letter, she insisted, yet her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. I do not understand why your question suggests that I might be involved in some scheme. I love my husband. I would never do anything to harm him. Love is a curious emotion, Poirot observed mildly. It encompasses a wide range of responses. Tell me, Mrs. Edgware, what was your relationship with your previous employer prior to your marriage to Lord Edgware? She stiffened visibly. My previous employer? I worked as a companion, a social hostess. There were several, not several, Poirot interrupted gently. One in particular, a widow of considerable means named Countess Malvina de Severez. Is this not the case? Vivian's face paled. How did you? It is my business to know these things, Poirot replied. I have made inquiries. I have learned that you were employed by Countess de Severez for a period of 16 months. The Countess subsequently became the victim of a fraud scheme involving forged documents purporting to establish a claim against her late husband's estate. The scheme resulted in the Countess transferring a sum of £70,000 to various accounts in France, after which she realized the fraud and took her own life. The color drained entirely from Vivian's face, and she seemed to age. Visibly before Poirot's eyes, I had nothing to do with that, she whispered. I was as deceived as she was. I believed the man when he told me that the documentation was legitimate. I was merely conveying information. I was not you. Well, convey what information? Poirot prompted. I was told to befriend certain widows and divorcees of substantial means. I was given descriptions of individuals who might be susceptible to particular schemes. I was paid modest sums to report on household routines, valuables, and financial arrangements. I did not know that anyone would be harmed. I thought it was merely, she broke off, covering her face with her hands. I thought it was merely investigation for purposes of inheritance claims or something equally mundane. I did not know that the schemes would extend to actual fraud, and yet you continued the employment. The money was substantial, and I had no other means of support. When the Countess died, I was horrified. I immediately ceased all contact with the individuals involved. I left Paris and came to London under an altered name. Mashford is, in fact, my mother's maiden name. I wished simply to disappear into respectability, to forget that I had ever been involved in such matters. And then I met Edward at a dinner party, and he was so attentive, so powerful, so certain that he could make my life right. I believed that if I married him, I could escape my past entirely. I believed that becoming his wife would transform me into someone respectable, someone worth respect. Instead, Poirot observed, "Your past has returned to haunt you in the form of a blackmail scheme." I swear to you, Monsieur Poirot, I had nothing to do with this letter. I had no contact with anyone from my previous life in years. I do not know who sent it, but I swear by all that I hold sacred that it was not I. Poirot observed her carefully, and what he saw in her face was genuine terror, not the theatrical fear of a performer, but the actual, unvarnished dread of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around them. "I believe you," he said finally, and watched as Vivian sagged with relief. From Vivian, Poirot turned his attention to other members of the household. He questioned Richard Edgware regarding his knowledge of his father's past affairs, discovering in the process that Richard's unhappiness was rooted less in the marriage itself, and more in his father's apparent conviction that his son was engaged in some sort of financial embarrassment that required investigation and correction. "He asked me about my financial situation," Richard explained, his voice bitter, not with concern, but with suspicion, as though he believed I was engaged in some sort of fraud or embezzlement. When I assured him that my finances were entirely legitimate, he seemed disappointed, as though he had been hoping to find grounds for conflict. It was characteristic of our relationship, not out of hatred, you understand, but out of a fundamental inability to simply accept one another as we are. From Richard, Poirot proceeded to Lady Constance, whom he found in her private suite perusing a recent edition of the Tatler with an expression of profound disapproval. "The family name," she said without preamble, as though their conversation had been ongoing, "has been dragged through sufficient mud in recent months, without the addition of this ridiculous marriage. I warned my brother that marrying beneath one's station would result in precisely this sort of complication, but he would not listen. My brother, you see, has always been susceptible to the appeal of a beautiful woman, and he has never, in his 70 years, learned to distinguish between beauty and character. You believe your sister-in-law is responsible for this blackmail scheme?" Poirot inquired. Lady Constance considered this carefully. "I believe that the woman is fundamentally untrustworthy, and that she has attracted untrustworthy associates to herself. Whether she is actively involved in this particular scheme, I could not say with certainty, but I would not be surprised to learn that she has connections with those who are." Finally, Poirot turned his attention to Miss Sarah Montford, and it was during this interview that a crucial piece of evidence emerged. He found her cataloguing artifacts in a small office off the main excavation site, her capable hands handling ancient objects with reverent care. "Miss Montford," he began, "I believe you have been more observant of the household than most. I wonder if you might share your observations with me." She set down the object she was examining and turned to face him with an expression of careful neutrality. "I am not certain that my observations would be of any value, Monsieur Poirot. I am merely a scholar attempting to perform her work." "Observation is always of value," Poirot replied. "And I suspect that you, Miss Montford, have observed a great deal more than you have allowed others to perceive. For instance, I believe you have observed that there is a connection between Mr. Frampton and the blackmail letter. Am I correct? She stiffened visibly. I would not presume to speculate. You need not speculate, Poirot interrupted gently. You need only tell me what you have observed. After a long moment of internal struggle, Miss Munford relented. 3 nights ago, she said slowly, I could not sleep. The desert heat is quite intense at midnight, and I was taking a walk around the hotel grounds. I observed Mr. Frampton meeting with a man I did not recognize, man with scarred features, who spoke with a French accent. They were discussing something with considerable intensity, and I heard fragments of the conversation. They were discussing the letter and whether Lord Edgware would cooperate, and whether it was time to move to the next phase of the scheme. And you reported this observation to no one. I was uncertain whether I had understood correctly. My position here is dependent upon Lord Edgware's goodwill, and I did not wish to interfere in matters that might prove to be misunderstandings. But I confess that I have been deeply troubled by what I witnessed. You are correct to report it, Poirot assured her. You have provided a crucial piece of information. Mr. Frampton, despite his apparent distress, appears to be complicit in the blackmail scheme either as an active participant or as someone being coerced to participate through means we have yet to discover. Poirot's revelation regarding Mr. Frampton's involvement sent shockwaves through the household. He presented his evidence to Lord Edgware in the presence of the British consul, who had been summoned to Petra to oversee the matter, with an appropriate degree of official involvement. It appears, Poirot explained, that Mr. Frampton has been under considerable financial duress. He has, I have learned through inquiry with the hotel staff and local authorities, contracted significant gambling debts to individuals of questionable reputation. These debts were called in approximately 2 months ago, at which time Mr. Frampton was approached by a criminal organization operating fraud schemes across Europe. He was offered a choice: contribute to the success of a scheme targeting Lord Edgware, or face consequences regarding his debts that would prove most unpleasant. But Frampton has worked for me for 15 years, Lord Edgware protested. Why would he not come to me? I would have assisted him with his difficulties. Because Poirot explained with sympathy, he was ashamed. A man's pride, Lord Edgware, is often the last thing to surrender, even when surrender might be the more rational course. Mr. Frampton saw himself as trapped. He was given a specific task: to identify a target of sufficient wealth and social position to make a fraud scheme profitable. He selected you, I believe, not out of malice, but out of the logic that seemed to suggest you were the appropriate victim. And the letter regarding my past affair, a genuine letter, Poirot confirmed. Your secretary confirmed that such a letter existed and was destroyed. However, a copy was apparently retained by the woman's family or discovered in her private papers after her death. The French criminal organization obtained this letter and used it as the foundation for their scheme. But here is the crucial insight. They intended the letter to arrive not after your marriage to Vivian, but rather before it. The original plan was to use the letter to discredit Vivian and prevent the marriage, thereby allowing them to approach you with an even more elaborate scheme involving her alleged reputation. What changed? Lord Edgware demanded. Timing, Poirot replied. The letter was delayed in transit. By the time it arrived, you had already married Viviane. This forced the criminals to adapt their plan. Instead of using the letter to prevent the marriage, they used it to extract payment from you under the threat of scandal. Your secretary, guilt-ridden and desperate, allowed them to use him as the liaison for the delivery of the blackmail demand. Where is this organization based? The British consul inquired. In Marseille, primarily, Poirot replied. The individual organizing the scheme is a man named Monsieur Henry Develle, known to Interpol for his involvement in numerous confidence schemes and fraught operations. Mr. Hastings and I have already dispatched the necessary information to the appropriate authorities. I believe arrests will follow shortly. In the days that followed, Mr. Frampton's complicity in the scheme was investigated thoroughly, and it became apparent that his involvement had been coerced through his gambling debts. The French consul, in consultation with the British authorities, determined that while Frampton would face charges related to his participation, the primary responsibility lay with the criminal organization that had manipulated him. Lord Edgware chose, with characteristic pragmatism, not to press charges against his long-serving secretary. Frampton, devastated by guilt and shame, accepted this mercy with tears of gratitude, though he immediately tendered his resignation from his position. He made arrangements to enter a sanitarium in Switzerland, where he hoped to address both his gambling addiction and his psychological distress through treatment and rest. Vivian's situation proved far more complicated. While she had not been complicit in the blackmail scheme, her past involvement in the fraud organization's reconnaissance activities could not be ignored. The British consul informed her that she faced potential charges in France related to her role in the deception of Countess de Sèvres, though this would depend upon whether the French authorities chose to pursue the matter. Poirot undertook a final conversation with Vivian, speaking to her in private with an unusual degree of gentleness. "You are to be pitied, madame," he said, "more than condemned. You were a young woman without resources or protection, and you were exploited by those who recognized your vulnerability. You made errors in judgment, yes, but error and criminal intent are not the same thing. Moreover, you have attempted to transform yourself into something better. This attempt, though imperfect, speaks to the possibility of redemption." "What will happen to me?" Vivian asked, her voice small and uncertain. "That depends, in part, upon what your husband wishes," Poirot replied. "He has the option of seeking an annulment of your marriage, which would render your union void and would leave you unprotected against any charges the French authorities might wish to pursue. Alternatively, he might choose to maintain the marriage, and to assist you in facing whatever legal consequences emerge from your past. What he chooses will reflect his own nature and his own judgment regarding what justice demands." "I love him," Vivian said quietly. "It is Cursi began this marriage with no expectation of affection, only of security. But I genuinely care. For him, I know that he is angry and betrayed, but I would rather face punishment than be separated from him." Lord Edgware, upon reflection, chose to maintain the marriage, though on substantially revised terms. He and Viviane underwent a period of separation while the French legal authorities made their determination regarding her culpability. Ultimately, a negotiated settlement was reached, and Vivian was required to pay restitution to the family of Countess de Sèvres, while avoiding formal criminal charges. She later returned to London with her husband, and they established a quiet life away from the social circles that had initially drawn them together. One evening, several days after the resolution of the primary mystery, Poirot and Hastings found themselves once again walking along the path toward the treasury at sunset. The light at this hour transformed the stone into something approaching flame crimson and gold and violet, bleeding into one another as the sun descended toward the horizon. "I must confess," Hastings said, "that I am not entirely satisfied by the resolution of this affair. While we have identified the blackmailers and established Vivian's reluctant involvement in her earlier misadventures, there remain certain questions unanswered." "Such as?" Poirot inquired, though his tone suggested he already knew precisely which questions occupied his companion's mind. "Such as the matter of Lord Edgware's decision to maintain the marriage despite Vivian's deception. Given his pride and his social standing, one might have expected him to seek an annulment and publicly repudiate her." "One might have," Poirot agreed, "if one understood Lord Edgware only superficially. But you see, Hastings, beneath the pride and the social concern, Lord Edgware is primarily a pragmatist. He has married this woman. The marriage has become, through the process of time and legal procedure, a fundamental fact. Moreover, and this is the crucial psychological insight, he has discovered that this woman, despite her deceptions and her past errors, is capable of genuine feeling for him. This is a discovery that has altered his perception of the marriage. You believe he loves her. I believe that he has discovered something rarer than love at the outset of marriage," Poirot replied. "He has discovered that genuine affection can emerge even from deception, that trust can be rebuilt through honesty in the present moment, and that forgiveness is sometimes the most powerful weapon in a relationship. These are insights that many never acquire." They walked in companionable silence for a time, watching as the light continued its transformation across the face of the ancient city. "There is one final matter," Poirot said at last, "that I have not yet shared with Lord Edgware, though I believe the time approaches when he should be informed." "And what is that?" Hastings inquired. "During my investigation," Poirot explained, "I made certain discoveries regarding the Armenian documents that caused Mr. Frampton such distress. I learned that these documents are not, in fact, medieval manuscripts at all, but rather forgeries, very clever forgeries created approximately 5 years ago by a master forger operating in Istanbul. The original scheme was to plant these documents among Lord Edgware's collection, allow him to authenticate them, and subsequently make a formal claim that the documents had been stolen from a private collection in Armenia, thereby recovering them from the thief. The scheme would have netted several £100,000. "Good Lord," Hastings exclaimed. "Another fraud scheme involving Lord Edgware." "Not directly involving the criminal organization," Poirot clarified. "Rather, this was an earlier scheme, abandoned when its architect was arrested by Turkish authorities approximately 3 years ago. However, the documents remained in circulation, and someone, I believe it was Mr. Frampton's contact in the French organization, acquired them and recognized their potential for use in a supplementary scheme. The Armenian documents were to be presented to Lord Edgware as the foundation for a claim against him regarding a supposed recovery operation, thereby creating a pretext for extracting payment. Will Lord Edgware be informed of this? I believe that he should be, Poirot replied. He is, despite his pride and his occasional cruelty, a man who values truth. Moreover, the knowledge that he narrowly escaped yet another fraud scheme may serve to temper his self-recrimination regarding Vivian's deception. No man is truly masters of his circumstances, Hastings. We are all, in one way or another, subject to forces beyond our direct control. The wise man acknowledges this and acts accordingly. On the final evening of their stay at Petra, Lord Edgware invited Poirot and Hastings to a private dinner. Present were also Richard Edgware, Lady Constance, Miss Sarah Montford, and, notably, Vivian. The atmosphere around the table was considerably lighter than it had been during previous dinners, though an undercurrent of something not quite tension, but rather a kind of thoughtful awareness persisted after the meal. As they took their ease with coffee and brandy, Lord Edgware addressed Poirot directly. "I believe, Monsieur Poirot, that I owe you not merely thanks, but something approaching formal gratitude. You have untangled a web of deception that might well have resulted in considerable damage to myself, my family, and my wife. Deception," Poirot mused, "is always present in human relations, Lord Edgware. It is not the exception, but rather the rule. The wise man does not assume that others are entirely as they appear, but neither does he assume that their capacity for deception precludes the possibility of genuine affection and honorable intention. You have learned this lesson, and you are the wiser for it." "I have, indeed," Lord Edgware agreed, and Poirot observed that as he spoke, his hand found his wife's beneath the table. "I have learned that the world is far more complex than I had previously believed, and that judgments made in haste are often false judgments." "And yet," Lady Constance interjected with characteristic sharpness, "we cannot live our lives in perpetual doubt regarding the veracity of those around us. Surely there must be some basis upon which we establish trust. There must be, Poirot." "Agreed, but that basis must be grounded in careful observation and in the acknowledgement that human nature is not binary, not entirely good or entirely bad, but rather an admixture of virtues and failings that even the individual himself cannot entirely comprehend." Richard Edgware, who had been quiet throughout much of the conversation, suddenly spoke. "I came to Petra convinced that my father was attempting to punish me for some imagined failure. I was prepared to be defensive, angry, and bitter. What I have discovered instead is that my father was himself confused and vulnerable, prey to the same uncertainties and misguided judgments that plague us all. This has altered my understanding of who he is and, perhaps, of who I am in relation to him." He turned to his father with an expression of genuine warmth, and Lord Edgware, clearly moved, reached across the table and clasped his son's hand. Poirot and Hastings exchanged glances, and in that exchange was the satisfaction that comes from witnessing a genuine reconciliation, from observing the restoration of order not through the imposition of external justice, but through the internal transformation of understanding. As the evening wore on, conversation turned to lighter topics: archaeology, the peculiarities of desert travel, the remarkable preservation of the ancient structures at Petra. Miss Sarah Montford regaled the group with amusing anecdotes regarding the complications of cataloguing artifacts, and even Lady Constance was observed to smile, though she maintained her characteristic posture of dignified restraint. Later, as Poirot and Hastings walked back to their rooms, Hastings reflected aloud. "It strikes me, Poirot, that the resolution of this affair has been unusual in one particular respect. Typically, in cases we have encountered, there is a criminal prosecution, a clear demarcation between justice and injustice. Yet in this case, those most culpable for the fraught scheme remain at large, while those who are manipulated into complicity escape with minimal consequences." "This is true," Poirot acknowledged. "But, you see, mon ami, the criminal organization will not remain unpunished indefinitely. Interpol has become aware of their activities. Arrests will follow. Monsieur Duval and his associates will face justice through the proper channels of law enforcement. But Mr. Frampton and Mrs. Vivian required justice of a different sort, the restoration of the possibility of redemption. For this, their cooperation was essential, and mercy proved more efficacious than punishment in securing that cooperation. A utilitarian calculation, then. Not merely utilitarian, Poirot replied. Humanitarian. You see, Hastings, justice without mercy is merely revenge, and revenge solves nothing. But justice tempered with the recognition that human beings are capable of transformation and growth, this is justice worthy of the name. 6. Months later, Poirot was seated in his London flat, perusing a letter that had arrived with the Morning Post. The letter was from Miss Sarah Munford, who had completed her work at Petra and had accepted a position as assistant curator at the British Museum. She wrote with evident pleasure regarding her new employment and her satisfaction that the excavation at Petra had been concluded successfully. In the postscript, she added, "I thought you might be interested to learn that Lord and Lady Edgware have resolved their difficulties and have established a harmonious household in their London residence. Lord Edgware has undertaken certain philanthropical projects with remarkable enthusiasm, and his wife assists him with evident satisfaction. They appear to be, if I may be permitted to observe, genuinely happy. It seems that even the most troubled beginnings can result in satisfactory conclusions, provided that all parties are willing to acknowledge their errors and attempt redemption." Poirot smiled as he read this final paragraph, and he carefully folded the letter and placed it in a small box where he kept his most valued correspondence. He then turned his attention to the elaborate mustache cream that occupied his considerable time and energy, attending to the grooming of his facial hair with the precision that characterized all his actions. Hastings, who had entered the flat unannounced, as was his habit, observed this ritual with amusement. "You seem satisfied with the resolution of our Petra adventure, old friend," he observed. "Satisfaction," Poirot replied, "is the province of mediocre minds. But I confess to a sense of rightness regarding the outcome. Justice was served, the guilty were identified and will face consequences, and those who were misguided rather than truly malicious have been given the opportunity to transform themselves. Moreover, a family that was fractured has, through the process of investigation and revelation, been rebuilt on a more honest foundation. This is, I think, as close to perfection as the imperfect world of human relations allows, and the mystery itself," Hastings prompted. "You have not, I think, fully explained your reasoning regarding the identification of the conspiracy and the various actors within it." "The mystery was never complex," Poirot replied with characteristic modesty. "It was merely the standard pattern of human weakness, exploited by those possessed of less conscience than their victims. What made the case interesting was not the mystery itself, but rather the psychological landscape in which it occurred. Here were individuals each struggling with particular vulnerabilities, particular desires, particular fears, who became entangled in a web of deception that might have destroyed them, had they not possessed the capacity to acknowledge their errors and attempt redemption. This capacity for redemption, Hastings, is what elevates humanity above the merely criminal. It is the ability to recognize one's failures and to attempt, however imperfectly, to correct them." Hastings nodded thoughtfully. and the two men settled into companionable silence. The kind of silence that comes only between those who have weathered considerable storms together and emerged with their friendship not merely intact but strengthened. By the experience outside, London went about its business with the indifference of great cities everywhere, unaware that within a modest flat lived a man whose capacity for observation and deduction had unravelled a conspiracy that might well have destroyed a noble family. But within the flat, in the presence of a truly befitting silence, Hercule Poirot attended to his moustache and reflected with the particular satisfaction of one who has restored order to chaos, on the curious and endlessly varied manifestations of human nature.